Hey there, in this series of videos we're going to take a look at how to take your raw 3D printed Mandalorian helmet to something a little more appealing. These steps can apply to any other helmet or 3D printed prop in general. If you're interested in this particular one though, it's available in the video description. So the helmet I'll be working on is actually a failed print of mine. I was making it for a customer, but something went wrong with the printer and it came out way too rough. Obviously no good to sell, but it's still in a perfectly fine condition for me to work on. It will just take a little bit more time. I mean, here's a comparison between this helmet and something that comes out right. You can clearly see how much more the layer lines stick out on this one, which will be a bit of a pain to work with. Nevertheless, I'll power through, and if you're printing the helmet yourself, this is to show that just because it doesn't come out right, you don't have to bin it. Anyhow, the first and the most important step when it comes to getting the helmet to look how you want it is the post-processing of the print. You want to sand down all the layer lines, even if they aren't as bad as this one, since anything that isn't perfectly smooth at this stage will show up under your paint later. So to do this you need to start off with a coarse paper, something like a 60 or an 80 grit, and then bring it up to 120 or 240. You don't need to go in exact increments, you can skip several levels and you'll be fine. Just don't go straight from 60 into 1000. So to make things easier for myself, I will actually be using this power sander. Doing it by hand is perfectly fine, but it will just take a bit more time. And if you plan on doing more than just one helmet, definitely invest in one of these if you don't have one already. You will see just how much faster it is to sand with one. Also, remember to use respiratory and eye protection, since the fine plastic particles will be flying all over the place. Something like an FFP rated mask should do just fine at this stage. Keep in mind that a normal clinical blue mask won't quite do the trick. You will see me wearing a full bodysuit, but that is just because I can't be asked to clean my clothes, and I also move around between the painting booth and this sanding area a lot, so I don't want to spread the dust everywhere. There's no need for you to be wearing one though. Let's get to the sanding. So if you're using regular sandpaper, just use it as you would with anything else. Circular motion is good, and sometimes moving up and down on the helmet can be useful as it will blend the layer lines together. For a power sander though, you will need to play around with how much force you need to apply and how long to stay in one spot, as if you stay in the same spot for too long, you will end up melting the plastic and it will look something like this. Not to worry though, you can just wait for it to cool down and then go over it to sand the melted part. Keep sanding until the print is nice and smooth. This is by far the most boring and time-consuming part of making the whole helmet, but spending time to sand it down properly is the most important part of the whole process, as simply using more filler or filler primer really won't quite do the trick. Keep in mind though, you don't necessarily need to focus very much on the very top of the helmet, as that's the roughest part of it and we will fill it in later. In my case I do actually manage to get most of it flat, but if you are sanding by hand, leave most of it up to the filler. While we're at it, I'd like to demonstrate why I think using a coloured filament is a better idea than just white. So take a look at this black piece of another failed print which I just want to use to test some colours on. See how it's nice and shiny, but then turns grey once sanded. This is not the case with white prints, and it can be quite difficult to tell which part is sanded and which is not. You just kind of go off the feel. Also, melted spots are a lot more visible on coloured ones. Not to worry though, if you do have a white one, clearly I am just fine with it. So now that I'm done with the 60 grit, I will take this 120 grit paper and just go over it by hand. Also sand down any parts that I haven't managed to reach with a power sander. If you wish, you can do the same thing with a 240 grit. I would not go any higher at this stage though. Repeat this process for any side pieces you might have. Now let's move on to filling. You can use pretty much any body filler, be it Bondo or P38 here in the UK, or really any other filler. Just make sure it's an easy sand one. I like to use one of these two wood fillers. The yellow one I use all the time, and then this white one is what I sometimes use on really rough patches. It's quite a lot stronger, but it's harder to apply. Now it's a generally good practice to degrease any surface that you apply anything on, be it filler, primer or paint. I will be using this 99% alcohol, and it should get rid of all the grease that this print might have to promote better adhesion of the filler. Now proceed to apply this wood filler to the surface. Make sure to apply a nice heavy coat at the very top of the helmet, as you want to cover all those large layer lines with the filler. Keep in mind, I've noticed that wood fillers tend to be quite brittle. I don't know if that's an actual property of them, but just in my experience it is the case. So sometimes bits and bobs may come off during later sanding stage. However, if you've done a good job at the initial sanding, this should not be a problem for you. You probably should be wearing gloves, as most fillers do require you to. Either they will be irritating to the skin or might simply stick to it and be very difficult to remove, such as the case with the white wood filler. This one, however, is fine on my skin, and why I love it so much is that as long as it hasn't fully hardened, you can just wash your hands underwater. Although one of the body fillers I accidentally bought literally says it causes impotency, so make sure to read the back label and use some common sense. Fill in any cavities you might still have remaining after the sanding. Don't worry about using too much, you can sand down most bits, but don't go overboard as it will just take you too long. Some people fill in the entire helmet. I don't usually do that, but in this case it was a little rough in most places, so just as a precaution I filled in more than was realistically necessary. In some areas where there's height differences, I do recommend to use a toothpick or something alike to remove the excess filler while it isn't dry, as some parts can be tricky to sand down like this one. Although even if you missed a spot, just use a sharp blade to remove it once it's hardened. Fill in the rough patches underneath the eyes, but again make sure it's flat as not to waste your time sanding later. Once you're done, leave the filler to dry for however long its recommended time. In my case it's 30 minutes, but I left it for a bit longer just to make sure. Now we return back to the sanding. The wood filler is very soft, so I switched the power sander to 120 grit and proceeded. Of course, don't forget the mask and the eye protection. This process creates a lot of dust. So actually, the same as with any dry sanding, I highly recommend you do it outside or in a very well ventilated environment. I have an air cleaner in the garage so the dust won't be an issue, but decide for yourself. I removed most of the filler with a power sander, but then proceeded with a 240 grit sandpaper. This just lets me get a nice polish to it. And in fact, it would be best to go forward with wet sanding, something like a 400 grit plus paper. But from personal experience, 240 dry tends to do the job. I, however, did go back and added a bit more filler and wet sanded with a higher grit paper. If you wish to wet sand, you simply need to get the sandpaper wet and sand as you would normally. Water allows for a smoother finish, and also you don't need to wear a respirator since the water keeps all the particles down, but feel free if you want to. It's also advised that you use waterproof sandpaper, but I just use the normal one. Waterproof simply would last longer without ruining the paper itself. I ended up switching back and forth between 120 and 240 a couple of times as I discovered certain spots that were a bit too rough. You should really spend your time on this post-processing. Any imperfections that you can see at this stage will most likely show up in the final finish. So if you need to, go back and grab some filler, fill in any spots you might have missed. In the next stages, when we move on to priming the surface and painting it, there's very little gap fill that can be done, so do spend your time on this stage. Now that we're finally done, let's compare before and after. Now you can really see the difference. Imagine applying paint to the first one. Now we are ready to move on to priming the surface before painting it. If you found this video useful, hit the like button down below and share it with anyone else who might need it. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next part. Take care.